I'm Mac. I'm Juan's Advocacy Director. I'm pleased to be joined by our three brilliant panelists. First, to introduce Rudra Kapila. Rudra has an extensive background in geosciences and has studied and worked everywhere from the University of Oxford's Environmental Change Institute in the UK to the Marine Biological Laboratory in Woods Hole, Massachusetts, which is about 30 minutes from where I grew up in Harwich. Her PhD research combined geosciences and international relations, focusing on carbon capture utilization and storage technology development and its potential for technology transfer through wider international climate frameworks, as well as how the politics of carbon capture technology will impact vulnerable emerging economies, such as that of India. Rudra now serves as the Senior Policy Advisor for Carbon Management at Third Way's Climate and Energy Program, where she advocates for policies to put the US on the fastest and fairest path to net zero emissions by 2050. She's also the co-chair of the Climate Change Working Group at Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security, one of Juan's favorite partners in the security space. And they work to promote diverse perspectives from women of color leaders in foreign policy and national security. And then I'll introduce our other two speakers and kick it off to Rudra to start us off. Liz Perez is a licensed general contractor in the state of California and has been in the industry for over 12 years. Before this, she served in the US Navy for over 8 years as an aviation logistics specialist and was deployed in both the Mediterranean and Middle East regions. Through her deployments, she recognized that saving energy meant saving lives on the battlefield. Liz is president and co-founder of GC Green Inc., a general consulting and contracting firm that specializes in clean energy and water conservation projects. GC Green also offers diverse financial solutions for clean energy projects. And Cindy Weissner has been organizing in social justice movements in the US and internationally for over 25 years, and currently serves as the executive director of the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance. She helped co-found the Climate Justice Alliance and has played a leadership role in the People's Climate Movement that organized the massive mobilizations in New York, Washington, D.C., and San Francisco in recent years, and is an advisor to Groundswell's Liberation Fund. Cindy started organizing with Here Local 2850 in Oakland, California, and went on to become the director of organizing for People Organizing to Win Employment Rights in San Francisco, and an organizer and board member for Generation 5. She has also been a consultant for Men Overcoming Violence Everywhere and Mujeres Unidas y Activas. And then a little bit of housekeeping. So each of our panelists have prepared a few minutes of opening remarks, and then we'll shift into a bit of a conversation. So attendees, if you have questions for our fantastic panelists, please use the Q&A function to the right of the video to ask them. And I'll come back to those questions closer to the end of the panel, and be sure to pose some of those. Now, just briefly to frame our panel and explain why we're doing such a deep dive into climate issues this week. The way that we create and use energy to power our economy, including by transporting people and goods, is creating the greenhouse gases responsible for climate change, which is putting our communities at risk and costing us billions of dollars. The volatile nature of global energy markets, paired with the weaponization of energy resources and infrastructure, put both economies and entire societies at risk. As today's panelists well know, the energy landscape is changing rapidly, with new technologies decreasing the cost of clean energy and increasing the efficiency of fossil fuel systems. Still, cities and towns across the country and across the world must prepare for the effects of climate change, and city and local governments need to be at the front line of these efforts, investing in innovative solutions and clean energy technology, helping create new kinds of jobs, and making communities more resilient for when disaster does strike. So Rudra, I'd love to kick it to you for some opening remarks, and then we'll move to Liz, but please.
Good morning, and delighted to be here. Thank you so much to the organizers and for inviting me to join this very esteemed panel. So as Mac mentioned, my background, I am a geoscientist, I'm a climate scientist, and my PhD is from the University of Edinburgh, where I was part of a very large team focused on carbon capture, utilization, and storage technologies, and in particular, looking at how these technologies could be used in emerging economies. That was the crux of my research. The work I do now at Third Way, which is a wee think tank in Washington, D.C., but has significant impact in the federal policy space. I work in the climate and energy policy team. And as a senior policy advisor, my focus is on carbon management and industrial policy. Now, what does that mean? So I'm a geologist by training, and my work has largely focused on how to get polluting industries, whether that's steel, cement, oil and gas, all of these industries, to actually not only cut their carbon emissions, cut their pollution. And I'm not just talking about carbon pollution, I'm also talking about other criteria pollutions, anything that impacts air quality and water quality. How to do that, how to design. So a bit of engineering thrown in here. So looking at designs of technologies in an innovative way that targets not only the point source of the pollution, but also the legacy of emissions. The thing about carbon dioxide is it hangs out in our atmosphere for a very long time. And in addition to these industries having to clean up their act, we also have to deal with the legacy of the pollution, which has impacted severely, most severely, to minority groups, minority and ethnic groups here in the United States in particular, but also all across the world. So there are certain technologies that I focus on currently, which kind of ties in with the work that's on focused on Congress at the moment. So that's the bipartisan infrastructure bill, as well as reconciliation. So even though I work on carbon management in our team at Third Way, we have people focused on electric vehicles, but also a very big part of our mission is to get the clean energy payment plan, the CEPP, what they refer to, embedded in reconciliation, which would be a big boost across the board to a really large portfolio of technologies. We're at this stage that we've run out of time. And so we really need all the tools in our toolbox to tackle this issue. And I think I'll kind of leave it at there. One last thing I want to say, given that the audience, there are a lot of state legislators here. If the two bills pass, fingers crossed they will, there will be a very large influx of money coming into various states to run these programs, which is going to be amazing in terms of opportunity, economic benefits, good paying jobs for a lot of communities. I integrate some of my experience doing EJ work, environmental justice work, into the design of these technologies, so that from the very start, these technologies and projects should be designed in a way that they integrate and take in the concerns of communities from the very start. What's been happening in the US traditionally is that communities and project developers meet for the first time at the litigation stage. And that's not a way to do and enforce these. That's not a way to develop and deploy these technologies going forward, especially if we have to meet our climate goals, but also meet the environmental goals for these communities. So I'll leave it at that. I'm happy to answer any questions. But yes, thank you.
Thanks so much, Rudra. Liz, would you like to share your opening remarks?
Sure. Let me get started. Hold on.
retrograde, creating havoc for us all.
Isn't that the truth?
Let's try that again.
There we go. Perfect. Thanks, Lynn.
The beauty of remote everything these days, right? Well, good morning. Who needs coffee after that? Well, I just want to thank, Rakia for inviting me here, and also you, Mac. Thank you for your leadership and for introducing me to Will. And I love Ruja's words on the policy part of things, because it is so many times that same story where a lot of the groups don't meet until litigation happens. And I definitely see that in my space. And just a little bit about my background. First, I want to recognize my tribe. I'm from Norfolk Rancheria. I'm Mono Indian, and I'm from the Eagle Clan. And for those that don't know where that's that's in the exact center of California. Actually, we have a sign that says it. And, growing up Native, I never really understood those worlds so much as you, and part of that understanding those worlds is bringing my native world into this today's world. And I guess, can you hear me okay? And what I'm trying to get at is living in, and if anybody that is native in the audience may recognize, is trying to understand living in the Western world and also my native world. And I didn't really understand that life's journey until now in my 40s. And what I mean by that is, when I first enlisted in the military and going on deployments and having that reality gut check of where I was, what our mission at that time was. And even now, I really felt that there was something wrong and more that we can do as a nation. And what I mean by that is our thirst and dependency for oil. And a lot of the reasons why we find ourselves in conflict time and time again. And when I transitioned from the Navy 8 years after serving active duty and the several deployments, I knew that there was something more that I needed to do. And that something more was just pretty, not the time, not knowing how natural it was, but it was more of like, it was magnetic, and it brought me to what I do today. And what I do today as a general contractor, I'm in the clean energy field, and I do a lot of consulting, primarily with local municipalities, state and federal, in basically job creation in the clean energy world. Hence why I chose to get a general contractor's license in this field, to put a lot of ideas to action to where there's job creation. And as I've been in business for the past 11 years, there's the power to create jobs, and also the power through knowledge and being boots on the ground to also change and develop policy so that we can ensure and empower disadvantaged communities within our state, within our cities. And it's so important that at the front end we disadvantaged communities to shape a better world and to address climate change. And right here in California, as you hear on the news, and even this morning, we have, unfortunately, a lot of wildfires. And indigenous practices can be a part of solving that, in addition to involving those within our community in rural California, within Indian country, and also focusing on mitigation and being ahead of solving the problem versus addressing the problem. So solutions are definitely the key, and actually why I'm here today, and really to discuss that amongst its panel and part of that journey. And what I really just want to drive home also, and then we can shift into conversation, is that things are changing. They have been. Rewind 12 years ago, 13 years ago, I was the only woman on a lot of these panels, our clean energy panels. I was the first woman to here in San Diego County to sit on the disabled veteran board. And not only woman, but also woman of color, a minority woman. So yes, I got some strange looks, but now that's not the answer. This is our norm. This is who we are as American people. This is who we are as a state. And we just absolutely, in order to solve a lot of these issues that we see globally, we do need to have a diverse executive board at the table moving forward. And I thank Will for having the will to be able to bring these type of issues to discussion and light and to be able to solve these problems. So thank you again.
Thank you so much, Liz. And Cindy, let's see if all your tech is working.
Can you hear me?
Yes, amazing. Thank you.
Oh my goodness. Serious Mercury in retrograde, y'all, because this is good. So good morning, good afternoon to everyone joining us here. It's such an honor and privilege to be part of this conversation, and we're going to try to give you a lot of information in a very short amount of time. But I think just the colleagues that are virtual stage with, just incredible thinkers and fighters, and just really honored to be here. And so thank you for inviting us. So my name is Cindy Weisner. Like Max said, I'm the executive director of a community-based movement building organization alliance that is national, that does work at the intersection of demilitarizing not only in our communities, but around the world, around climate change and environmental justice and a just transition framework, around racial and gender justice, and around movement building. And so that's part of the work. So we're a membership-based alliance here on Turtle Island, all across the U.S. And we basically are really trying to bring together the issues that deeply impact communities and what we call frontline communities, right? The communities that are in a lot of ways at the crosshairs of many of the issues of poverty, of oppression, of discrimination, not only currently, but also historically, and trying to actually create a collective agenda that is visionary and that's transformative, and that doesn't actually try to just solve the issues in the most immediate sense, but actually begins to articulate much more what we're calling permanent solutions, real solutions, grassroots solutions to the colliding crises that we're seeing, right? Not only economically, ecologically, but also the crises that we've seen faced in particular in the last period around our democracy. And so for us, we do a lot of the local organizing work, but we also federate at a national level, but are able to build with each other to cross-share information, to cross-share experience, to actually build out campaigns that begin to think about what is it that we're going to need to, again, resolve the issues in a way that not only meets the needs of the people, but also the planet. And I think that we have been, for many, many years, talking about the importance of, sort of our slogan is no war, no warming, build a feminist regenerative economy for the people on the planet. And that, I think, sort of sums up the title of this discussion, right? Is that how are we going to move from a war economy to a economy? And how is it, particularly as women, gender nonconforming people, as feminists, that we begin to really articulate a different vision of what's necessary, right? Because what we always talk about in our work is that the current system that we're living in centralizes greed, centralizes profit, centralizes death, right? And for us, from our perspective, is really like, what about if we actually put life at the center? What about if we put our bodies at the center? What about if we actually put nature at the center? What would be the different conclusions? What would be the different policy? what would be the different laws we have in place? And I think that is what is dramatically different and counterposed to a war economy, and that what movements and individuals, right, from social movements here in the U.S. and around the world, from academics and researchers, from scientists, from business folks, for like Elizabeth, former veterans that are then really rethinking how is it that we're going to remake economy and and be in right relationship to each other, not only to nature, to each other, but to other peoples and nations. And in this moment where, again, what we're facing is pretty, catastrophic in terms of the impacts of climate change, but also mishandled and inappropriate uses of war, and what happened in the chaos that Afghanistan is in now, a war that should have never been started. And then now it's like the worst possible scenario, not only for the progressive left sort of communities, and people talk a lot about women in Afghanistan, but ultimately being able to take full responsibility around that. So very happy to join you all here, share with you some of our work. We have some people on the ground right now in Washington, D.C., and I'll share a little bit more about some of the mobilizations and why people are mobilizing, why Indigenous peoples, why communities that are impacted are putting their lives on the line and defending their territories, but also articulating what is it the right path forward.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, all three of you. I think you have teed us up perfectly for our first question, which I'm going to direct to Rudra and Liz in particular. But because climate change is an issue that affects the entire globe, I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on how you think the US needs to think about foreign policy and our relationships with our partners around the world in order to tackle this existential issue. And in particular, how might the US, our current framework of competition and military buildup with China affect global efforts to address climate change? So whichever of you would like to go first, please.
I'll have a crack at this. I think we're in a very interesting time. Interesting because it's compounded by urgency, but also it's a real inflection point. And I say inflection point is because Democrats are, they have the executive, they have the House and the Senate. And there really is a chance to use these three levers of power combined to come up with something very revolutionary and robust to help us get to our climate goals that we need. But the US can't do this on its own. Yes, we could pass legislation here, but fossil fuels are not going away anytime soon, unfortunately. Just to give a recent example of Lebanon, where there were power outages, perhaps for days on end, shortage of fuel, the military had to come in. There's power shortages in Europe. In our immediate future, and when I say immediate, because as climate scientists, we're mapping out for our climate goals to 2050. So let's say for the next 2 decades, the US definitely has to get out of the competitive mindset and certainly go for collaboration. I also want to put in here that if you look at a lot of the science and innovation that is predominantly located in the global north, that is forming the foundation for these climate solutions, that shouldn't be the case. Indigenous science is very, very important. They have solutions to our problems that need to be integrated and considered, and not just science and innovation coming from the global north. We need to get solutions and innovation from the global south. There are countries in South Asia that have a very unique way of innovation. It's called jugaad. That's the non-technical term, but it is a very different approach of tackling climate change, especially when you're dealing with meager financial resources. So my approach to tackling climate change on a global stage is the US has the resources right now and the levers of power to really make a fundamental change to its energy system, and it should. But I also think going forward, and as we collaborate for global climate change solutions, there needs to be a concerted integration of the innovation and science from other parts of the world. I think, for example, Liz can talk more about this, but definitely tackling wildfires in Australia. They're now, finally considering Aboriginal practices for managing wildfire. Like there has to be, it's all like all hands on deck situation regarding climate change. And I think certainly that I'm feeling quite positive. I think these next 2 months are going to be very, very crucial, especially what goes on Capitol Hill, because this is the portfolio and framework of strategies that Washington wants to take to Glasgow for the climate change conference, to the UN, and hopefully partner with other countries to do so going forward. So I'm feeling hopeful. I'm feeling that, a lot can be achieved. And I know Mercury's in retrograde, but don't lose the faith, because we are at this inflection point and this is our time.
Great. Liz, would you like to add anything?
Absolutely. And yes, Rudra, it is our time. This is the time to not do things as the norm. The norm has not worked before, and it's, gotten us where we are today. And what I mean by that is, the first thing when you asked this question, Mac, I thought of my time as a U.S. delegate in Israel. And during that time, what I saw was a lot of, despite what you hear on the news, there is collaboration through more philanthropic sources through Israel, and bringing nation to nation together, and taking a look at entrepreneurial opportunities to combat climate change, to combat the drought issues that they have there in that region, and then also taking a look at entrepreneurial opportunities within solar as well, and taking a look at what we can do in solving those opportunities. Also, local farming and having that farmers market. It's something as simple as that, and growing your own food and bringing nation and nations together, and that intergovernmental there's approach, collaboration, and what that can bring. Those two things, or many things, can bring a lot of economic growth as well, and nation together, nation to nation, building an understanding. Just from my point of view, and taking a look at, again, from my experience in the military, my experience abroad serving as U.S. delegate, and also my experience as a Native woman, and taking a look at the issues that we have here in California with a lot of, some parts of it even third world. I hate even calling it that, but it's actually pretty, I hate to use this word too, but disgusting actually. And I'm going to be honest. What we have here is a lot of disparity. You have a lot of gaps that need to be closed, not just here in America, but a lot of gaps within our own governmental system that we can close, and it's just right in front of us. And I believe part of what that is right in front of us is a lot what we can learn from each other here. And as Rudra had mentioned about the cultural burning, just in 2018, they passed here in California that natives can do cultural burning. Yes, it's called cultural burning. What is that? What is that is more of mitigation of a lot of the the dead trees, the dead debris that you see on the sides when you're going to the Sierra Nevadas. And part of that is just not to burn, but do it in a way that is cultural and spiritual, to renew Mother Earth. And there's a lot of negative, yes, happening, but through that there's a lot of positive. If you could see the positive through all this negative, and that positive is opportunity. And what that opportunity is, again, is economic growth. To take a look at tackling climate change in a way that becoming that consultant to combat these fires, to working with local governments and being that sound piece, that expert that can put different perspective into policy. Those are opportunities that's actually very needed right now within our state. Many times I'm taking a look at these contracts here, and a lot of it needs that native voice, needs that underserved community leader voice, which we don't have. We need many of our businesses that do exist. We need to put those out front, state and center. We need to put them front and center to answer a lot of these problems, because as we take a look at even developing these plans and programs with, even I'm using California example because I'm here, we just don't have that perspective, enough of that perspective right now to solve these issues. And I would say almost the same is happening globally, because a lot of the decision making that's being decided is not involving those that are most vulnerable. So we need to engage. We need to engage with our these communities of the underserved or minority communities, whatever you want to call them. And I come from that community, and we need to take a look at leaders like ourselves and our sisters, our brothers that are next to us, and have been a part of that journey, and allow them that opportunity to be a part of the problem solving in this process. And then again, as well, and grow also economically in that way, in helping us solve these issues.
That's fantastic, Liz. Thank you. I'm actually going to flip our second and third question, because I think you've moved us into exactly what I wanted to talk about in our third question, which relates also to the thousands of climate activists who were gathering yesterday in Washington, D.C. on Indigenous Peoples Day to demand that President Biden restrict fossil fuel projects. So you have, I think, started this conversation really well, Liz, but I'd love to hear a little bit from Cindy as well about the urgency of this issue, how it relates to Indigenous Peoples Day, and how we're seeing groups across the country from various identities come together to try to combat the impacts of climate change and create sustenance for our communities out of the havoc that's been wreaked upon them.
Thanks, Mac. So as I shared at the beginning, a lot of folks in Washington, D.C. Basically convened to one ahead of the upcoming UN COP26 climate negotiations. Many of our member leaders from the Indigenous Environmental Network and many of our allies from the Build Back Fossil Free Coalition, mass actions, right, where over 1,500 people are coming together to participate in taking civil disobedience, to be able to generate some media coverage, but also to put some pressure on the Biden administration to respond to the demands, right? About number one, being very clear about stopping federal fossil fuel project approvals, to declare climate emergency, and to really begin to, heed to the call that people directly impacted and organizations on the front lines have been talking about around these fossil fuel extractive projects, right? Like the Line 3 pipeline, like the drilling in the Arctic, and many other sort of developments that are being put forward. And so we are supporting those mobilizations. And part of it is being able to make the connections, right? That I think the bigger connections that both Rudra and Elizabeth are talking about is like that communities across the US and across the world have been devastated by military occupation, by war, by state sanctioned violence. And the US military, and we all know this, and I'll keep reiterating, is one of the single largest consumers of fossil fuels in the world, and has served, as an enforcer of occupation of indigenous and sovereign lands, and upholding, the violence of extraction. And part of it is that in order to address climate change, we have to deal with the military industrial complex, right? We have to be able to as well think about and make the connections, like the Black Lives Matter movement, the uprisings we saw in record numbers of millions of people in the streets in the middle of a pandemic, that talked about militarized police forces in our communities, right? And Latinx communities, Black communities, Indigenous communities, Arab communities, Pacific Island communities, poor communities, right? And the violence also that we see against women and femmes and gender nonconforming people in the carceral sort of system, prison industrial complex, right? So for us, we make all of these connections because we believe we have to. We have to be able to make a just transition to a regenerative, anti-racist, feminist economy, right? And that we must end the wars, we must end military culture, we must end the violence of militarized forces, not only in our communities, but around the world. But then what are we investing in, right? And what are we trying to sort of support? And impact on many communities, not only here in the US, but around the world. We've been pairing up and building very deeply. We're part of the Green New Deal National Network. We are part of, different initiatives called the Feminist Peace Initiative, but we've also been building with our sisters and brothers and kinfolks in the movement for Black Lives, so that we can be talking about where is the disinvestment, right, coming from, but where are we trying to invest? And part of that is there's a policy level, there's an organizing level, there's a narrative change level, but part of it is that there's also a moral responsibility to be able to, in the middle of what we're seeing in these colliding crises, to begin to head on and deal with the militarization of our federal budget. And we see that from the top all the way down in our state budgets and our local budgets. And for example, I'm just going to give you some little things, right? If you cut 10% of the $78 billion defense budget to address climate change, if we just think about it as just like enough to just cutting water, for example, so that would mean like if we were to invest $37.2 billion a year of water infrastructure, it would create 945,000 good paying jobs. We would advocate them being union jobs, living wage jobs, jobs with health and medical insurance, but it's they would be called climate jobs, right? That they're improving the conditions of our communities, dealing with what's happened to this day in Detroit, Michigan, and Flint, Michigan. People are still not having clean water. It is absolutely immoral, unacceptable for that to be happening. But then the real investment through this reconciliation process is to make those demands so those resources are there. But then we're both, again, putting care, putting people, putting the rights of nature first and forehand, and not just a big bloated Pentagon budget that then serves to go kill people and kill the planet. So I think we're at a crossroads, right? We're at a crossroads, and I think that we have an opportunity, and why mobilizations on the streets are so important still in the middle of the pandemic, because people are very clear, like the direction around false solutions, the direction around quick fixes, the corporate-based models of what we call greenwashing are not going to work. We need to be able to listen to the solutions that are coming from the ground, from the scientists, from people who've been the canaries in the minefield, to tell us the direction we're heading is like we got to do an absolute U-turn and really trust and invest in new ways of actually dealing not only with the crisis of climate, but also the economic, political, the democracy challenges that we're having in this particular moment.
Wow, a big amen to all of that, Cindy. I feel like you should have opened our conference because you have perfectly tied together all of what we're trying to do at Wandwell, and what we're trying to do in collaboration with many of our partners. Later in October, we'll be talking a lot about militarized policing, and how it impacts our communities, and how it's tied in with our foreign policy as well. So you highlighted a few things that are super important to remember here, which is that the Pentagon's climate footprint is very, very heavy. It's more than most countries and more than most countries combined. If the Pentagon were a country, it would be something like the 5th largest carbon emitter in the world. And you also highlighted, the massive size of our Pentagon budget and how investing in our military and in weapons systems means that we're disinvesting in our people and our communities and the things that we need. You also highlighted several different things that we could do with that money. We at Will Wand are advocating for this 10% cut, which we hope is just the beginning of a larger change of US budgeting priorities. But this 10% cut would be about 78 billion. And Rudra, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on what that $78 billion could do to address climate change, or increase resilience. How could we use funding at that level, with our global partners and or at home?
Oh, wow. If I were to be given $78 billion. Gosh, there's so much, absolutely so much. One thing, so I work on carbon dioxide removal. That's my wheelhouse. I work on technological solutions. So one of the things I mentioned was like taking residual emissions or the carbon dioxide taking out of the air. That aside, nature-based carbon dioxide removal is equally important. And I think if we had that money, I would be investing in nature-based solutions alongside the technology solutions. So for example, a lot of the policies in place in the infrastructure bill, as well as in reconciliation, have really focused on the science, innovation, technological solutions. With this extra budget, I would be really investing in greening of our urban spaces. I don't know if many of you know this. There was an excellent article in the New York Times about this, but a lot of scientists already know this. Spaces, affluent neighborhoods in cities tend to have more greenery, more trees, and that lowers the temperature within that space. And what you find is that low-income areas largely populated by Black and brown folks, they tend to be predominantly concrete, and that raises the local temperature. So, these seem very minor things, but if we were to do them on a very large scale and really invest in some of these greening of urban spaces, putting in sustainable farming practices, I think there really needs to be a pairing of the nature-based as well as the technological solutions. Like I said, I've been saying from the beginning, it is all hands on deck, all tools in the toolbox. So I also want to say, not that I would use the 78 billion for industry, but one of the things I want to point out is that a lot of the onus for solving climate has suddenly fallen upon people. But I really think there needs to be a concerted push on industrial decarbonization. they have the resources and the capacity to do it. So I wouldn't use the 78 billion for that budget, but I would definitely like use some levers if I had at my disposal to really kind of force industry to clean up their act. But yeah, this 78 billion, man, let's put it into like nature-based solutions that could go side by side with, we do unfortunately need the technological innovation, because thinking globally, if you look at other countries' energy systems, let's take South Africa and India as an example, and even Brazil. So these just so happen to be the case studies of my PhD, but that set aside, they are essentially functioning on energy systems that are a legacy of colonialism. Where did they see to burn coal and generate electricity and base their entire grid on coal-fired power stations? They got that from their colonial masters. So again, back to that thing, we have such a legacy of pollution and emissions that need to be dealt with. And I think those can be done side by side. But yeah, this 78 billion, that needs to go into nature-based solutions. That's what I would do if I had my way, but I never have my way, so.
Well, thank you. And that is definitely something that, especially as many of our state legislators will be going into lobby meetings at the end of the month with their federal legislators, you've given us lots of food for thought as to things that they can be discussing with our federal legislators. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A box. I'm going to pose one and see how far we get. We may have to close before getting to the others, unfortunately. This has been such a good conversation. But let me pose one and see where we get to. So I'll hit this button and it pops up. So many of our state legislators have more one-on-one conversations with people in their districts compared with their congressional representatives. What are some major day-to-day changes that our lawmakers can emphasize to their citizens as they advocate for a green economy over the war economy? And I think that's really looking at the state level. When you have a smaller group of people who you're talking to, it's hyper localized. What can those changes look like on the local scale?
I'll answer that. Well, at least I'll try to here. Well, I do agree with Cindy on how everything is connected, because that is definitely how Indigenous people think, how Native people think, that every action that you have done kind of affect later 7 generations out. So everything that we do today does affect something somewhere later. So all of our decisions are important moving forward. And also what Rudra had mentioned, it's all hands on deck. Absolutely, it is. This is not the time to continue on with the norm. And part of that norm is, as you had mentioned, the state legislators and our state leaders. One word of advice I would say: get out of your box. Go out and visit those underserved communities. Go out to Indian country. Get to know the communities that are out there protesting. Understand them, befriend them, understand what their challenges, those issues are, and get to know some of their practices as well. And then from that, base those policies and decisions from that experience. And take a look at what local leaders that are within those communities and how to empower those communities to be a part of that legislative process. And that's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Liz. Absolutely agreed. Have to be out there on the front lines with your constituents. Any additional thoughts, or please?
I was just going to add one wee little thought. And now kind of this is back to my days as a community organizer and a field, working in the field, and a field organizer. When you're talking to your constituents and you're talking about these, let's say, both bills pass, which they will, manifesting that right now, then, you know, there's going to be a concerted effort to bring in money and programs into various states for these climate projects. And when you talk about these climate change projects, a lot of people sometimes they're like, yeah, but what's it doing for me? Fine, you're like you're cutting down carbon emissions, which matter globally to the entire kind of global equation of taking out carbon dioxide. But what does it mean to the individual? And that's where you talk about how a lot of these technologies, whether they're renewable or whether direct air capture, they are, you know, what does it mean to them in terms of their water quality, their air quality, and bringing in economic benefits, bringing in jobs, bringing in money to schools, bolstering and augmenting community colleges, so that when we are building these projects, we're using the engineers and skilled labor force from the local community college rather than bringing in, you know, out of state. So it's really about, when you are talking to your constituents, think about how these projects could help them individually in terms of whether it's their economic benefit, how these projects make their electricity more reliable, so that's like energy security, and also how it improves the air quality locally. Having green spaces within your neighborhood is suddenly lowering the temperature, so we're not dealing with extreme heat, which will become more and more common as we go forward. But, you know, it's always about bringing these larger projects and what that means to the individual, and showing them the value of how climate action is also of benefit to them.
Thank you, Rudra. I am just going to pose this last question quickly, and then see if you all have a couple of closing words for us. But especially, I know Cindy has dropped some resources in the chat box, so I'm going to ask this question, which asks for resources. So opponents of the green economy often mention that the cost to create and maintain green infrastructure is too high. Do you have any statistics, resources, or research recommendations that lawmakers can use when advocating for and drafting green legislation? Cindy or others, Rudra, I know you have a paper that's out that we're going to share after this session as well. But Cindy, would you like to mention some of these resources you've shared in the chat box?
Sure. I don't have a direct statistic to answer right now that question, but I'm sure someone here will be able to share that. But I think part of what I think it's more about our priorities, right? It's more about what it is that we prioritize, because right now we're in a pitched battle around this reconciliation bill, right? And we think about sort of the money that, like, without a blink, got just okayed a couple weeks ago towards the military budget. And so I just think that at the end of the day, it's about what matters, and what's and I think it's about being able to point resources to the things that matter. And I think that if there's anything, this post-Trump moment, this, like, we're still living in the pandemic, we're in the sort of throes of, like, basically still dealing and contending with white supremacy and anti-Blackness, the moment of, like, sort of the Me Too movement. It's like people are in motion in ways, and I think we're seeing an extreme level of polarization in our society, and particularly here in the United States, with the last election being very clear, right? We have a lot of work to do, and part of that is being one vision that all of us can actually see ourselves in, right? One that actually deals with our material realities, the stress and sort of impact that the economic, like, many of our communities have not survived the economic recession of 2008, right? And part of that is being able to actually be real about now the debt that many people are in given this pandemic. And that the reconciliation bill that's trying to move through Congress right now is an attempt to be able to deal with that, not only immediately, but over the long term. So that's one thing, right? So I think it is about prioritization, and it's about political and moral will. Second thing is that there's an opportunity. I put some links. We've been part of organizing, for example. We just put out a report, many reports, but a report in partnership with Madre and Women Cross DMZ, along with many other feminists, particularly women of color, but also anti-war feminist people like Felix Fenis and Medea Benjamin, around really thinking about what would it take to have, again, a feminist approach to thinking about our relationships around militarization and demilitarizing, and what would that mean in terms of prioritizing not only our needs, but prioritizing reparations for people that and peoples and nations that we have done harm to as the US, right? And what does that begin to get articulated? Number two, there is a question about what we're contending is like, what are sort of false solutions versus real solutions. And, we're on the side of saying no to carbon markets, saying no to things that, again, that you put a price on oil, that you put a price on air, on water. And part of that is that there's many movements and many indigenous peoples and different communities, not only here in the US, but around the world, that are putting out a critique. And so that's the second report around chasing carbon unicorns. And we have to be able to be very clear and sober about what are then going to be the real solutions that take us out of this climate crisis. And the third resource is about what to do. Our sister organization called IPS, the Institute for Policy Studies, does great reports. And they have a report that talks about 10 better uses on the Pentagon budget on the 10%. And so I think this is really sharing. And those are some of the ideas that many people, and I know that Will and Juan, have also been articulating this. So just to let you all know, we're here, as Elizabeth says, as resources. We're here to be able to share different points of view, and we're here to be part of the conversation and in partnership to be able to, again, deal with the root cause issues, but also be able to materially make changes in people's lives and be in right relationship to nature.
Thank you so much, Cindy. Well, I think that's actually the perfect transition into our closing. So I'm wondering if, Rudra, would you like to do a minute or two, and then Liz, and then I'll close us out so that everyone can, have a sip of water and a refresher before our next session. Yeah, Rudra, would you like to go?
I just put in a link to the International Energy Agency Net Zero by 2050 report. This just came out this summer, and that might be of help to some people. It's certainly, it kind of earmarks the trajectory in order to meet our climate goals by 2050, and what we could expect, what kind of technologies, for example, a real kind of influx of electric vehicles over the next decade. So it kind of goes by a decade per decade progression, and I thought that might be really helpful for state legislators to look at in terms of their environmental policies and climate policies. In terms of closing, gosh, I don't really know what to say other than how I started saying that we're in a real inflection point. And I must say that from my experience, this is a very long and grueling fight, especially those that have been working in environmental justice. Even for people who are just really dorky, nerdy climate scientists like myself, I've been doing this for well over a decade, and I haven't seen much progress being made. However, now, given that we're in this post-Trump, currently in a global pandemic world, everyone has become really hyper aware about climate change, which is great. Finally, the penny has dropped. And I think momentum is on our side. People see that this is not something that's far off in the distance. Now this is something here on their doorstep, and I feel that the energy and the momentum is certainly on our side to make real change. And we should definitely, you know, kind of carry that momentum forward and use it to help us in our own work as individuals in whatever field that we're doing to carry this moment forward. So I'm like, keep up the faith, stay positive, guys, and keep on going.
We have to, or we're never going to get it done. So thank you. And Liz, would you like to close us out?
Sure. And, you know, the first thing that comes to mind is that we're at a point right now where we've experienced what that other side looks like. And now we're in this point where we have an administration that can make some awesome changes, unlike any other American leader has done before. And right now is that opportunity. And why not seize that opportunity right now? And yeah, I think it's time a little uncomfortable. We've been uncomfortable for a long time. And what I mean by that, being uncomfortable, is doing things outside of the norm. I've worked in government and military and also in time there. And it is, what I do hear a lot is like, well, we've never done that before. That hasn't been done before. Well, it's time to go outside of that norm and yes, get a little uncomfortable and there is a such thing as creativity within government policy. And I think we can find that. And through that we can find collaboration. And I believe that we can do it right now with this American leader under this administration. And I do have, right now we have our first Native American Interior in the history of the United States. That's a big accomplishment. So with, besides all of the, you know, what we just talked about isn't so, you know, it's a little bit dark and gloomy, but at the end of this, I'm a very optimistic person. And I am, because I believe that throughout all of these years, we are still here. And with that, in closing, we're going to continue to be here, but we have to work together. So thank you for the opportunity. And I do have faith in all of us.
Thanks so much, Liz. And thanks so much, Cindy and Rudra, for sharing all of your wisdom with us. We're looking forward to continuing to collaborate and learn from you and learn from all of the communities that you're working with on these important issues.